Thank you so much for coming. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Indigenous DB and Donjba. My name is Sarah Rice, and I'm Anishinaabe, a member of the Garden River First Nation. I'm the director here at the University of Sudbury of the Indigenous portfolio. So I do want to welcome you here to the University of Sudbury. We're so privileged to have Dr. Carrie Bourassa with us to talk about cultural safety and anti-racism. We will make sure that people who don't have a chair get one, and there are a few chairs over here if people would like to have a seat over here. I want to say again, welcome, and I want to thank you all for taking the time, to join us and spend your time for the next couple hours talking about this really important subject. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are located in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, specifically the territories of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe and the Wampatay First Nation. And we're also right in the heart of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 territory. So we've invited Dr. Bourassa here to talk about cultural safety and anti-racism and what that means in the university setting. My hope is that this conversation will help inform us as members of the University of Sudbury community, whether you're staff, faculty, or students, about how we as a community can continue to do our work in a good way and in a way that builds on the University of Sudbury's reconciliation work and enhances our continual efforts to create a welcoming, inclusive, and culturally supportive institution. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Carrie Bourassa, and I'll read out her bio here. So Dr. Bourassa is the Scientific Director of the Canadian Institute for Health Research's Institute for Indigenous Peoples' Health. Through IIPH, she leads the advancement of a national health research agenda to improve and promote the health of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. First housed here in Sudbury at the Health Sciences North Research Institute, her institute is now operating from the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. Dr. Bourassa has spent over 15 years serving Indigenous communities as a professor of Indigenous Health Studies in the Department of Indigenous Health, Education, and Social Work at the First Nations University of Canada in Regina. She is an Indigenous community-based researcher and is proud to be the successful nominated principal investigator on 2 Canada Foundation of Innovation grants that funded the Indigenous Community-Based Health Research Lab in 2010, which has now been renamed to Morningstar Lodge. And most recently in 2016, the Cultural Safety Evaluation Training and Research Lab. Dr. Bourassa is a member of the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists of the Royal Society of Canada and a public member of the Royal Canadian Council of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. In 2012, Dr. Bourassa won the, can you tell me how to say that? Mishiniwashin Foundation Inc. Métis Award in Health and Science. Dr. Bourassa is Métis and belongs to the Real Métis Council of Regina. She earned her Master's of Arts degree in Political Science and PhD in Social Studies at the University of Regina. So please help me in joining and welcoming her with a good, big University of Sudbury welcome.
It is really good to be back here in Sudbury, and wow, what a turnout! I'm a little nervous now. So it's good to see some friendly faces, some friends of mine, some staff of mine are here, which is great, Dana and Seb. But yeah, it's really good to be back here. I really enjoyed my time here in Sudbury. So many beautiful people live here, and so thank you for coming. I'm not sure, I don't have a clicker, so I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll sit through behind.
Yeah, you don't mind? Oh, sorry, just don't put up here. And I particularly want to thank the University of Sudbury for inviting me, and especially Sarah. Sarah asked me a long time ago if I would come and speak here, and I enthusiastically accepted. So I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural safety, and I will link it back into academia. I've been doing cultural safety work for a very long time. I started in academia at First Nations University, pulling this into curriculum there. I developed a Bachelor of Health Studies program in partnership with the University of Regina, Kinesiology and Health Studies, and the Faculty of Arts with First Nations University, and we developed a very unique program and really focused on addressing systemic racism within health sciences. And that included working with the Faculty of Nursing, where our Indigenous health class that really looked at understanding history, our shared Canadian history, and the colonial context, and linking that to understanding the contemporary context. Like, what does that mean? What does our history mean? History means something. And understanding how to start to address the contemporary issues. Because I think so many students come into, or at least I felt so many students came into our classroom and wanted to sort of jump to the solutions, right? I think that's how reconciliation is working right now, where we're really jumping to reconciliation without really understanding the truth part. We have to understand our context if we're really going to get to those solutions. And what I found is that if we didn't include that in the curriculum, if we didn't understand fully the Canadian context, those underlying Indigenous social determinants of health, that includes colonization, that includes those hard subjects about racism, about stigma, about bias, and how to address those in looking at it from a systemic point of view, a systemic way, because we live in colonial systems every single day, whether it's in education, whether it's in health, whether it's justice, and we really have to start to understand not only what that looks like, and what the implications are, but then how to deconstruct those systems, right? Whether you're Indigenous, whether you're not, we all have a role. And so cultural safety isn't so much about culture, it's about deconstructing those systems and what our roles are as individuals in that. And so for nursing, it was vitally important to have, that course included, Indigenous health studies included in that, but also to have those elements of cultural safety, to understand what is bias, what is stigma, what is systemic discrimination, what is systemic racism, so that at least they had some foundational principles going into their nursing course, and that is still a requirement in the nursing program, and it's a start, right? One course in a program is not enough, but it's a start, and now we're seeing that more in medical education programs and in other programs across Canada. Do we need more? Absolutely, but that's really what I want to speak about today. So if Sarah's gonna flip it for me. So again, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Tikishing, Anishinaabe, and the Wanapitatai First Nation, situated here in the Robinson Huron territory. And for me, being a visitor here from my territory, Treaty 4 territory, I was welcomed, and I just want to thank everybody who welcomed me so much while I was here, and again, welcoming me here today. I was taught by my kukum that you always ask for permission, and that was, our territorial acknowledgements go back generations, because we always had to ask for that permission to come into another territory and to be thankful and grateful when you come into that territory. So I'm really thankful that you're having me in your territory today, which you can flip this. I had a really good lesson just before I left Sudbury. And one of them is that I think many First Nation, Métis, Inuit people, we don't talk enough about ourselves and about some of the good things that happen in our life. And I think we're sort of told, don't brag, right? Be humble. And I think that's important. But I was taught by an elder at the book launch that happened just across the way a while ago, that it's important to share good things that happen, so that you inspire other people and that you remind other people that Indigenous people, we're role models too. We do good things. And so ever since I had that teaching from that elder, I've started to share a little bit more about myself at every presentation. Because I think that sometimes in humility, we don't tend to share maybe some of the good things that we do, and we should, all of us. So this is a picture of myself at the Royal Society of Canada when I was inducted. And there was 97 inductees, only 3 Indigenous people were inducted. And I sure as heck didn't think that I should have been one of them, but I was. And I think every time that I get some kind of an award or an accolade, I think, why me? There's so many other people that should have been there instead of me. And my cooking scolds me about that, right? Because she says, you were chosen for a reason, and you need to represent our people, and quit thinking about that. You have to accept on behalf of your community. And so I've been trying really hard to do that. And so I'm pretty happy here. And the reason I was happy there was because for one of the first times in the history of the Academy, they asked an Indigenous person to speak about Indigenous research ethics. And I was one of them. I was pretty happy. I was pretty happy to have 3 whole minutes to speak about Indigenous research ethics. But I was shocked that I actually made a bit of an impact. When I was finished, it was dead silence, and I thought, oh wow, I really lost them. I lost them all. They don't know what I'm talking about. But I think that I actually did make an impact, because after I was finished and I went back and sat down, I had a lot of people coming and asking me questions and saying that it's really important that what I spoke about, and that they need to know more and they want to learn more. And so that was a really important night for me, not because of the award, not because I was inducted into this very old, predominantly non-Indigenous society, but because perhaps this was going to be something very good for Indigenous communities across Canada. So it was an important time for me. I belong to the Regina Real Métis Council number 34, but I really don't like to be put into boxes. So I'm Anishinaabe, I'm Tlingit, I'm Métis, and I don't like the government telling me who I am. So sometimes that gets me into trouble, but it's just how I feel. I think that we still live in a colonial state. We're not post-colonial by any means, and I think that our communities should be defining who we are, not our government. So I sometimes get into a little bit of trouble about that, but that's how I feel. My grandfather pretty much raised me. I was born to teen parents who I love very much and very dearly, but they were very young. My mom was 15 when she got pregnant with me, barely 16 when she had me. My grandfather had grade 3, my mom had grade 7, and my dad had grade 8. And for me, I grew up in a very dysfunctional home, and that's not to say that I didn't have love. I did. But, love only carries you so far. And so I can tell you without a doubt that if my grandfather had not quit drinking when I was around 4, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here, because the norm for me was dysfunction, alcoholism, drug abuse, violence. And I thought that that was a normal thing. And I never ever thought about going to school or university or what even that was. But I did have my grandfather who, he really guided me and kicked me in the butt when I needed to, and kept me on the straight and narrow. And I can remember him telling me a great deal that I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I can remember him whispering this to me in times of utter chaos when there was, fights going on. And I mean, bitter fist fights going on. And him saying to me, whispering to me, you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. I had no idea what a lawyer was, by the way, but it sounded pretty good. So I would just be, he would make me repeat that to him. What are you going to be? Doctor or lawyer, doctor or lawyer. So I don't think I'm the kind of doctor he wanted me to be, but I think he'd be okay with it. He passed away when I was 19, but I still get emotional talking about him, and I think this is the first time I haven't all out cried in mentioning him. But if there was a picture of him up there, I would cry, and I cried at a large event a couple weeks ago. It was a big TB symposium at The Hague, and they asked me to speak personally about tuberculosis because I did have it. I had tuberculosis, and he had tuberculosis, so I had a picture of him up, and there's about 2,000 people in this auditorium, and I was crying because I still feel that close to him. Because I just feel like I wouldn't be here without him, and the struggles that he went through were so much worse than anything that I went through. So for me, it's really important to honor him and honor my ancestors who went before me. And I think that when we think about colonization and the impacts that I'm going to speak about today, you think that you're going to stop that cycle, and I think for the most part, I was able to stop a lot of the cycles, but you never really do. It's not really, my kids are never going to really be untouched by intergenerational trauma. Probably not even my grandkids. And that's because colonization has not really ended. And I don't think we've really thought about how intergenerational trauma is intersecting with ongoing colonization. And I encourage all of us, whether we're Indigenous or we're not Indigenous, to really think about that. To really pause and think about the fact that colonization is still occurring in Canada today in 2018, and we are still struggling with that intergenerational trauma. And I don't want to make us victims, because we're not. We're very, very, very resilient people, but just to think about that intersection and that fact that most of us haven't even thought about how to deal with that, right? And in fact, my good friend Randy Ray and I were talking about that at lunch, right? I mean, we're very functional. Most of us are very successful, but it doesn't mean that we're not dealing with all of that trauma in some way, shape, or form, and that our kids aren't going to deal with that, or even our grandkids. Okay, so I'll get to what you really wanted me to talk about. I want to start about talking about what cultural safety is. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is cultural safety, because when people hear that word, they immediately go to culture. It's actually not about culture. And even when we talk about social determinants of health or Indigenous social determinants of health, my colleague, Barry LaValle, who, if you haven't heard of him, look him up. He's amazing, does lots of anti-discrimination work and lots of anti-racism work. And I'm so honored to be able to work with him, to learn from him. He's amazing. He works at the University of Manitoba right now, and I'm really, really humbled to have him work on the lab with me. He's just incredible. I can't say enough about him. But he's really explained to me and helped me to understand that when culture is used as a social determinant of health, it's really the wrong way to use it. Because if you think about it, for Indigenous people, the social determinants of health are things like colonization, racism, geographical location. So if you put culture in there, now what are you saying? Culture is now a negative determinant of health? No. Culture is very positive. It's a positive thing, right? Culture is what makes us strong. Don't use that as a determinant of health. And don't use Aboriginal ancestry as a determinant of health either. That makes that a negative as well, right? So I think it's important that we think about what are those social determinants of health for Indigenous people, because they're a little bit different for us. Some of them are the same. Income, for example, right? That's important. Education is important, but keep in mind that some are very, very different. And colonization is one of those things that we have to take into consideration. So cultural safety isn't about culture at all. Right? It's actually about some very, very different things. And that includes systemic issues, systemic racism, bias, stigma, all those things I was talking about at the start. So it's actually not about culture. And so Barry said, I think we have to, actually get rid of the word culture, and I said, yeah, but cultural safety actually emerged in New Zealand by Maori nurses, in fact. And so we can't really get rid of the word culture. But what we can do is add. So I think what we should be doing is saying cultural safety and anti-racism, because that really gets to the heart of what cultural safety is about. Okay? So cultural safety really, why we say cultural safety is because it actually encompasses all the other processes that have occurred over time. So we used to do cultural awareness sessions, for example, right? And cultural competency sessions. And now there's cultural humility. And the thing is, the great thing about cultural safety is that if you're doing it right, it encompasses all of those things, right? So that's the important piece to understand about cultural safety, is that cultural safety encompasses all of it. It takes us beyond cultural awareness, which is really the acknowledgement of difference, and it's an important start, but if you're only doing cultural awareness, then you're missing the systemic part of it. So the importance of cultural safety is that it takes into account all of those things, and you should, in fact, if you were undertaking cultural safety, you would have all of those pieces enshrined in basically a work plan, right? Of how to address, all of those issues, because you would need that. You would need the education piece, but education in and of itself is not going to address systemic racism. It won't. It'll be a piece of it, but you need much more than that. So it surpasses cultural sensitivity as well, right? The cultural sensitivity days. I'm sure there's many of you in here that did cultural sensitivity training too as well. That's a piece of it, and that recognizes that importance of respecting difference. But cultural safety will encompass that as well. And cultural safety really helps us to sort of understand, I guess, the limitations of cultural competence. You can only go so far with cultural competence, because that focuses now, the competence piece focuses on skills, knowledge, and attitudes of practitioners. So now you're getting a little closer to the safety piece, but not quite there yet. Cultural safety itself is actually predicated on understanding power differentials, and now we're getting somewhere. Because it really is about power. Okay? Systemic racism, systemic issues in general, it's about power. And this is where now practitioners, and it's hard work to do, but practitioners, whether you're an educator, whether you're a physician, whether you're a nurse, we have power. As an academic, I am in a power position, even though I'm Métis. As a professor, I'm in a power position. I have to do some real inward searching, right? What are my biases? What do I have to do, right? And that is really important because as an academic, I'm in a power position. So it's important to understand power. And there are power positions in health service delivery, there are power positions in academia, power positions in the justice system. So pick your system, pick your power position, right? So it's really important to understand that. So I'm using sort of, in this scenario, a patient-centered approach. If you're in academia, use an educator-centered approach. Right? It applies to different systems. And that is, I think, the beauty of cultural safety. So if I'm using this, I use a patient-centered approach because I do a lot of work in healthcare, but it easily applies to education as well. So if you're looking at a patient-centered approach, self-reflection is important, and it's equally the same in education, right? Self-reflection as a professor or a senior administrator, right? I mean, all of us in this room can probably think, maybe except for the students here, can think of a time when you've been in a power position. And for students, you can probably imagine a time where you can see somebody that has been in a power position that has affected you, right? So I think it's important for us to look from both sides. So cultural safety essentially focuses on systemic issues, including colonial-based racism. And there is a lot of work, of course, in the healthcare system, but more and more work is now being done around cultural safety and justice, the justice field, and in the education fields. So a central tenet of cultural safety is that the patient, or you can insert, student, you can insert, whatever you want here in terms of, depending on what system you're looking at, who will define what safety means to them, whether it's safe service or safety in general. And that is really, it's flipping the script, right? That's really the important piece here. And this will then open up the opportunities to learn about the unique history. So remember at the start I said the history piece is important. It's that truth piece that is absolutely essential. So we understand the current challenges and the successes of Indigenous communities in achieving equitable levels of health or education or justice, right? And wellness, I think, applies whether you're looking at education or whether you're looking at justice. And for me, health is everything. Health is education. Health is justice, right? Health isn't just this, quadrant on a medicine wheel where you say, oh, health is physical. Health is everything, right? So for me, cultural safety applies because health is everything. And my background, as you probably know, I'm a political science junkie. Like I came from political science. I came from doing 2 degrees in political science, and I did a social studies degree. I'm not a nurse. I'm not, and I value nurses, but I don't come from a mainstream health background. Health is everything. It's everywhere, right? And I think that is, that also comes from many, First Nation, Métis, Inuit philosophies in terms of health as well. Anyway, but I think sometimes we sort of go down this narrow lens of what health should be, and I just want to remind you that health is all around us and it's everywhere. In terms of if we're looking from a healthcare lens, but again, I just want to remind you this can be anywhere. We're encouraged to ask family members, health patients, communities, again, students, what matters most to you in terms of whether it is, in this case, in a healthcare setting, it would be illness or treatment, but in terms of how to address power differentials, how to start to address the systemic issues in the system. And these can be small or they can be large. But we're not going to sort of tear down a system in a day, right? But these can be policy changes, for example. They can be relational, but it's starting to see things in a different way, and start to work together to address those issues. So again, it's, I think, centered on, in this case we have patient-centered, but it's centered on the individuals that are accessing the system, whether it's justice or education or in this case, health. I want to go back again and go to reconciliation and talk about the TRC and again, their recommendations. I guess in essence, reconciliation cannot happen until we have the truth addressed. And it's to me, so many Canadians do not know the truth. And truth is the context to really getting to solutions and getting to reconciliation. And we can't have reconciliation before truth. And I think it's just a reminder that it is so very important that we all, come to that one space where we're speaking the same language around truth, so that we can get to the space of reconciliation. And then I think a very, very important point about reconciliation, if we looked at the language around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, around UNDRIP, UNDRIP proclaimed a historic body of collective rights and human rights of Indigenous peoples and individuals. UNDRIP basically says it all, that Indigenous peoples have rights. We have rights to our lands, and if we just took UNDRIP and implemented them as a framework for reconciliation, we would have it right. And if you look at UNDRIP and you look at the language, which I probably should have put the entire language there, but they nailed it. Right? It's there. The language is there. If we implemented UNDRIP, if Canada really truly took UNDRIP and implemented it, we would get it right. We would get reconciliation right just by implementing UNDRIP. So if we can flip the. So I want to talk a little bit about truth, and now some of you may know this, and maybe you'll be even adding to what I say and having more information than what I have. But I do want to give a little bit of a summary of Canadian Indigenous colonial history. And it starts with a little bit of terminology, and I'm going to go as fast as I can because I'm sure there's questions, but I think it's really important to have some of that, that truth that I'm talking about. So in terms of defining Aboriginal people, Aboriginal is, in my opinion, a colonial term. Aboriginal is a term that was crafted by the federal government without any input from First Nation, Métis, Inuit people at all. It excludes non-status First Nations people. And so to me, it's a colonial term. However, it is defined and enshrined within Section 35.1 of the Canadian Constitution. And so I know, and I respect this, that there are many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who prefer the term Aboriginal, and I respect that. I'm not one of them because I feel that it is exclusionary and I feel that it's colonial. But again, I respect those who do prefer that term. It is defined legally as Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. There are supposed to be rights attached to the term Aboriginal. For the most part, they are fairly vague and have had to be hashed out in the courts and continue to be brought through the courts to be able to, make them specific. So Indigenous people are very diverse, and I use the term Indigenous. I see it as a much more inclusive term. It is defined as First Nations people or those who are descendants from and identify with original inhabitants of a particular region, in contrast to groups who have settled, occupied, or colonized the area more recently. And again, it's much more international. Some people don't like this term. I prefer it because, again, I think it is much more inclusive. But our identities have been shaped, and they continue to be shaped by colonial and neo-colonial policy. And I think I'm being a bit kind here when I say that the attempted assimilation, which I actually think is genocide of Indigenous peoples, continues to impact all Indigenous peoples in Canada, but particularly women, and I'll show you why. If you want to flip it. So we have an Indian Act. It remains that we have an Indian Act. It continues on. And it continues to affect particularly First Nations people. But inadvertently, it affects Métis people as well. And between 1876 and non-status First Nations also. But between 1876 and 1985, one's Indianness, if you will, was traced through the male line. I think many of you probably are aware of this. And I'm going to use the term Indian only in a legal sense. I think most people, that term is not used very often, but so just so you know it, so I'm using it in a very legal term. It is still a legal term in Canada. So Indian women who married non-Indians, and that included Métis or Inuit, by the way. So Indian women who married non-Indians ceased to be Indians under the Act. Okay? These women were not Indians according to the Act. but neither were they considered to be Canadian citizens between 1876 and 1960. Okay? So, what would you call that? Pretty sexist, right? Sexist legislation. So Indian men could not lose their status through marriage, though, and in fact, if they married non-status women, then those women would gain status under the Act. Okay. In 1985, the Act was revised, not because there were many First Nations women who marched on Ottawa demanding that the Act change, not because of those brave women, but in fact because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms conflicted with the Act. That is actually why the Act was amended. Because and here's why. Because if, in fact, the Act was revised because of the women, there's no way the Act would have been revised the way it was, because the women wouldn't have stood for it. Because I'll show you how the Act was revised. Because the revision exasperated rather than repaired the problem. It made it much worse. And although assimilation was an official Canadian government policy from 1876 to 1973, official policy. Okay? And many considered that policy to be alive and well today. And I'll show you how, if you want to flip it for me. So in 1985, Bill C-31 was the revision to the Indian Act. And it was revised, as I said, because it conflicted with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And because it exasperated the problem. Now here's the revision. If those brave women who marched on Ottawa had actually revised it the way they wanted to, it would not look like this. Because here's the revision. So as of 1985, you no longer could gain or lose status through marriage, but rather you were assigned a certain status. So I'm going to really tell a corny joke, but a good friend of mine told me a long time ago, and hopefully you'll laugh. So now you were either a 6'1" or a 6'2" Indian under the Act. You were assigned that status, but it didn't refer to height, because I know lots of 6'5". I told you it was very corny. So in 1985, if you were a 6'1", it meant you were a status Indian on or before 1985. Okay, you were 6'1" Indian. 6'2" Indian meant you had to regain status. So you had to apply to regain your status. And 9 times out of 10, you were assigned a 6'2" status. Very rarely were you assigned a 6'1" status. Okay? Sometimes you were, but most often you were assigned 6'2". Now, why is that important? Because we're going to do a little bit of Indian Act math. Now, I apologize to the mathematicians, it's just that I'm not very good at math, and so my friend and I, when we used to do Aboriginal awareness sessions, we didn't like math, we weren't good at it, so we called this Indian Act math. Now, a 6'1" plus a non-status, now a non-status could be a Métis or an Inuit as well. So a 6'1" plus a non-status didn't affect individuals, but it produced a 6'2" child. Okay? So you didn't have to be married, but just if a child, happened, it was 6'2", okay? Now, another generation, so say that 6'2" grows up, has relations with another non-status, that produces a non-status child. 2 generations, you lose status, okay? Now remember when I said assimilation ended in 1973? What does that look like? Looks like assimilation to me. So it might not affect individuals, but it sure affected the family. And then here's where it gets really strange and why I call it Indian Act math. Because a 6'1" plus a 6'2" produces, ta-da, a 6'1" child. Okay? I don't know how, but it's magic. And a 6'2" plus a 6'2" child produces, ta-da, a 6'1". So what I found really interesting is that I happened to be on a plane, and I ended up sitting by a person who, I still have his card, but he happened to work for Indian Northern Affairs. I don't know how we got onto this subject. we started talking about this whole 6-1, 6-2, and he said, oh, I was working for the government when this was introduced. So I started asking him questions, and he said, yeah, I was in on this whole discussion when this policy came up, and he said, do you want to know what it was based on? And I said, I would love to know what it was based on. It was based on how cattle are bred. You can imagine how I had to really hold my emotions in, because I wanted to find out as much as I could about this policy. But he was really quite proud of it, because he thought it was very ingenious how they came up with that policy. It really shouldn't have surprised me, I don't think so much, except for that it was, like 2007, we're in the 2000s, right? Not the 1800s or 1700s, where you would imagine policies like that, as we now know, back then were fairly commonplace, but not in the 2000s. So it was pretty appalling. So this is still happening, right? This is still a policy. And it really affects families, right? So it's still based on who you marry. Now, I'll tell you a little joke from an elder, because elders tend to share stories that will make you laugh but also make you think. And way back in the day, I'm dating myself a little bit, I was a policy analyst for about a minute in the government, and I was sent to a workshop with the provincial government, and there was a Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations representative, and I was just there to watch. And this discussion was coming up about how eventually, what if there's not going to be any First Nations left, right, through intermarriage? And there was discussion about this, about, well, should we be talking about our communities, only marrying, First Nations, and all these, serious discussions, and you could see the tension in the room. And I understood that, I understood it was very difficult discussions going on. And you could see the elder, knew he had to sort of settle things down. So elder gets up, starts talking about his grandkids, and talks for a long time about being a Muslim, and how hard it is to be a Muslim nowadays. Like, you gotta talk about safe sex and all these things. And you could see in the room that nobody was going to interrupt him, but they weren't really sure where he was going with the discussion. I wasn't either, but it was really great to just listen to him talk about being a Muslim and, safe sex. And I had a daughter, and I was like, maybe I'm going to learn something about how to talk about safe sex and all this kind of information. And he's talking, he goes, back in my day, I would just have to say, to my kids, well, if you're gonna have, how did he put it? He goes, I think the best advice is, if you're gonna make out in the back seat of the Chevy, just make sure you ask the right question. And it's not, do you have a condom? It is, are you 6'1" or are you 6'2"? And everybody laughed, and it was, kind of diffused. But it also left people really thinking, is that where we're at with our kids and our grandkids? Like, are we really going to have that conversation? Are we really going to be having to ask those questions? So it was really funny, and he made a really, really good point. But I think it was also a reality, right? It's a reality check. Is that where we're at? Is that what we're going to be talking about? And I think it's no less important today, thinking about these kinds of things, right? Is that what we're going to have to do to preserve, rights as First Nations, treaty rights for those that have treaty rights? Is that what we're going to have to do? Is that where we're at? And is that fair? Is that what we should be having to do? So as I said, colonized state. And for women, it is still targeted at women. If you are a First Nations woman, and say you're 6'2", say you're in a 6'2" situation, so say you're here. If your partner that you had the baby with was a 6'1", but but you don't name the partner for whatever reason. Say you were in a violent relationship, for example, and you don't name the partner, the government will assume that he was non-status, and your child will be registered as non-status. And if you want to change that, then you have to have the partner sign the birth certificate. Now that could cause all kinds of issues for the woman, for the child. I'm not saying that men shouldn't be involved. I'm just saying that could cause a number of complications. So it is very, there's a lot of issues around the 6-1 and the 6-2 status. Okay, if you want to flip it, Sarah. Another issue is the lack of matrimonial real property rights on reserve for women. This is an ongoing issue. There are some serious consequences for women who have been living off reserve after a marriage dissolves, for example, or if their spouse dies. These are ongoing issues. I'm sure if you're on Twitter, there was just another recent story where some women were told they have to leave their home, their reserve after their spouse died. So matrimonial real property rights are a big issue. And there's sort of this lack of legal clarity that often results if women experience violence. It's another issue as well. So ongoing issue around matrimonial real property rights. If you want to flip it. So what is assimilation? I talked about it briefly. The official definition, it occurs when one group changes so completely that it becomes fully integrated into the dominant. And assimilation policy, as I said, was official from 1876 to 1973, and it begins with the Constitution Act in 1867, and it carries out in legislation and policy such as the Indian Act. So if you see this quote from 1996 of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the policy was designed to move communities and eventually all Aboriginal peoples from their helpless savage state to one of self-reliant civilization, and thus to make Canada one community. So there really was this view that Aboriginal people were savages, and they had to sort of move up this scale of civilization. And if you haven't sort of researched the Darwinian approach to colonization, not only in Canada, but really in many colonized nations, Australia, for example, the United States, even how other colonizers went about colonization, it's a very similar thread through the Dutch and the Spanish, the French. They had a certain view of how colonization should happen, and they used a social Darwinian approach to do it. And if I had more time, I would certainly spend it, but there's a lot of literature on this. So I'm going to explain to you as quickly as I can that genocide occurred in Canada. You can call it cultural genocide if you want, but it meets the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide from the United Nations. So there's 5 categories here. One is killing members of the group. One is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. One is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Another is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And another is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And I'm going to show you in the next few slides how Canada has met each and every one of these definitions of genocide. So here's where I'm going to show them throughout. The next few slides, I'm going to show you how, through the effects of colonization and the policies generated, not only the policies but legislation generated by the Canadian government over time, how genocide occurred. It wasn't sort of a kind of warfare genocide that you might be thinking about. It was actually done meticulously through legislation and policy. So the first one occurred really through the Indian Act in particular. That was one of the vehicles. Think about the pass and the permit systems that occurred from 1886 to the 1940s. The government would specifically use the pass and the permit systems together to ensure that they could control how much food was harvested, how much food was given and rationed out to communities, and they could literally starve communities to death if they wished at their will. And there's a lot of work that's been done in this area. Sarah, oh gosh, she's one of my favorite authors.
Carter.
Sarah Carter, thank you. Sarah Carter did some fantastic work around this. I highly encourage you to read her early work in particular. But she meticulously documented how the Indian agents would, how they controlled First Nations through the pass and permit system, and they would ensure that there was have families and have not families, and families could be starved to death. I know my own Cookham told stories about how she was the lookout. She was really fast. She was really very fast runner. So they were a have-not family on the reserve, and what they had to do is they would, if they were going to butcher any kind of animal, which you needed a permit to do, you needed the permission of the Indian agent to do, then she would be the lookout while they were butchering, so that if the Indian agent was there, she would run and let them know that the Indian agent was coming, so that they could clean everything out. So they just got caught one time, and she can remember them throwing everything out the back of the window of the shed that they were butchering in. And the Indian agent came and they didn't get caught, but she thought for sure they were going to get caught because she didn't think she was fast enough to get back and warn them to get rid of any evidence of the butchering they were doing. And that was just to survive, right? Because if the Indian agent said you weren't getting any of the money that you were owed for the harvesting or selling of wood or whatever it is that you were doing, and the Indian agent could decide to keep all of the money that you earned, or he could decide not to give you a permit to go and sell, or he could give you a little bit of money. It really depended on whether or not the Indian agent decided what he needed you for, or if you were not on his good list, or whatever it is that he wanted to do. The Indian agent controlled everything on reserve. And so it was, the permit and the pass system is what controlled reserves. And a lot of people say, well, why didn't they just rebel, right? Because the Indian agent controlled everything, absolutely everything. They could use, once residential schools were implemented and children, had to go to residential schools, they could use your children. They could put you in jail for not sending your children, right? Do you know that even in BC, when the potlatch was banned, they hired lawyers and they won at the first level of the court system. They got it overturned. And so the government disbarred lawyers who were helping any First Nations people, and they were not allowed to hire lawyers. Any First Nations in Canada were not allowed to hire lawyers. So, I mean, any time First Nations tried, to push back, to try to circumvent some of these restrictions, the government would clamp down. So, to try and say, well, I've heard people say, if I was in their shoes, I would have done this and I would have done that. Yeah, you weren't in their shoes and you don't know how it was, and you don't understand, the extent of the brutality of the colonial system. And that's not even to say what was happening once residential schools were up and running for generations, and people would come home and their kids would be unable to even speak in their language or remember the faces of their parents. So just to understand that the pass and the permit system played a huge role in ensuring that the Indian agent was firmly implanted in the control of the reserves. The residential schools started from the mid-1800s to 1996. The last one was closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. And as I said, they were unable to hire a lawyer starting in 1920 till 1951. There were some major revisions in the Act in 1951. Prohibition of ceremonies and dress started in 1884 till 1951. The only exception was the minister could give exceptions when the Queen came to visit and they wanted to see First Nations sort of dressed up and at exception of those kinds of things, they would take First Nations and have them at their ceremonies, dressed up, not sort of ceremonies, but they would bring them to the Queen, which was almost an embarrassment, right? Like parade them around at will. And Indian Agent really did control every aspect of life, and there was a work for rations policy instituted in 1879. So even if you were very elderly, if you were sick or infirm, so say that I wanted to go and do the rations for my cookum, that was not allowed. And this again goes back to the social Darwinian policy that, it was the survival of the fittest, and if those people couldn't, do the work for their rations, and if they died, they died. And there is, again, a lot of literature around this, a lot of documentation that was the policy, that if they were too infirm, that's just too bad, then they don't live. There was no order given for those people that couldn't do the rations. Yeah.
Just also to add that you also lost your status if you pursued a higher education.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So a very good point. If you wanted to pursue any kind of higher education, you lost your status. If you went and fought in the wars, which we just had Remembrance Days, and I was watching all of the First Nations veterans who went to war and they came back only to lose their status, be treated terribly after they came out of the war. They didn't get any kind of the what would the word be?
Pensions, benefits.
Benefits that other veterans received. In fact, it was almost worse for them, because then they couldn't even go back to their reserves. Because once you're on status, you can't go back to your reserve. So once you lose your status, that's it. So they went and fought and endured, the horrors of war, and then they came back and weren't even considered to be status anymore. So there was a whole number of ways that they would try to entice First Nations to give up their status as well. Sometimes they would, try to purchase their status, and many ways to try and get First Nations to give up their status, because again, the whole goal was assimilation, right? If you want to flip it. So here's a very famous quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, and he really was an author of many of the policies, particularly around residential school. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, this country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are should be not able to stand alone. This is my whole point. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole object of this bill. And this was when residential schools were made mandatory. So just a few stats, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. Between 1800 and 1990, there were over 130 residential or boarding schools. There were a number of active schools peaked at 80 in 1931. And in the early 1900s, about 1/6 of the children between the ages of 6 and 15 attended the schools. And by the 1940s, about 8,000 children, or half the First Nations student population, were enrolled in 76 schools across the country. And in some regions, including the Prairie provinces, the numbers were higher. So where residential schools left off, the child welfare system really took over. In 1992, there were about 93,000 former students alive. And while Métis people were largely excluded from residential schools, there were some that attended. About 9% attended residential schools. And most Métis were actually excluded from official education until 1930, which was much later in Saskatchewan. And that's because neither the federal or provincial governments wanted to pay for their education. So it's always been a bit of a sort of a ping pong match between the federal and provincial governments for Métis, and that was no exception even back then. So Justice Rory Sinclair said of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he declared that Canada's Indian residential school system was an act of genocide, and that the Indian residential school system, in both its stated intent and its observable effects meets the definition of genocide specified in the UN Nations Genocide Convention Act of 1948, which I said earlier. And he said that the convention defines genocide as committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, as such, and includes in the specified acts forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So that really did happen in terms of social services taking over. Do you want to flip it? In 1996, the Canadian Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and many other reports documented the emotional, the physical, sexual abuse that many children experienced. And in the 1990s, I don't know how many, but they say thousands of former students took legal action. I'm sure there's an actual number now, but against the churches that ran the schools and the federal government that funded them. And there were several civil lawsuits that sought compensation for the injuries and for the loss of language and culture. So I think 2007 was when the class action lawsuits were resolved, and they implemented the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So when the 60s scoop occurred, Indigenous children made up, in 1960, only 1% of children in care. By the late 1960s, it rose to between 30 and 40% of children in care. And Indigenous children from across Canada were taken from their homes, placed with families who were, and the criteria was white middle-class Christian families. And really, the justification they made was based on income, Christian beliefs and practices, and then the children would be removed if the family was not practicing Christianity. So this practice continued into the 1990s. Manitoba alone had over 3,400 children removed between 1971 and 1980. And here's a recent statistic. This was a quote off of the CBC website. The numbers are staggering. Indigenous, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children under 14 make up 52.2% of all children in foster care. And there are 4,300 First Nation children under the age of 4, in foster care across the country. And in Manitoba, there are 10,000 children in care. So sterilization. So this is, again, one of the acts of genocide. Sterilization not only happened historically, but you probably heard Senator Yvonne Boyer, who is a friend of mine, a colleague. She is launching an effort, and I think an inquiry into current sterilization. Sterilization is still happening today, so Indigenous women in particular are having sterilizations without their consent, sometimes without their knowledge. And while it was certainly unacceptable in 1972, for example, and one that happened in Alberta in 2003, it is particularly unacceptable for it to continue to be happening in 2018. And so, she's hearing from many Indigenous women that these sterilizations are still happening. And so she is working hard to address this, and I really congratulate her on taking this on. It's a very important issue, and it is an act of genocide. So Alberta passed their Alberta Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928. It lasted until 1972. 2,800 sterilizations, both optional and compulsory, were performed on women. The First Nations community represented about 2.5% of the general population in Alberta, but First Nation and Métis people made up 25% of the sterilizations. And then also they would disproportionately assign the mentally deficient rating for First Nation and Métis, which meant that they were denied legal rights. So I don't think any of those were optional. They were compulsory sterilizations. The government of Alberta apologized in 1999, and they settled with about 600 people, women. And a similar program operated in BC starting in 1933, and they were sued for sexual assault in 2003. So what are the contemporary implications of this, of colonization. How do we understand this in terms of moving forward? If we look at that context of that truth, how do we move forward to addressing the contemporary issues? Part of it is looking at determinants of health. And Health Canada, they look at issues of globalization, migration, cultural continuity, colonization, territory access, poverty, and self-determination. And I think those are still pertinent. And some, but not all, health determinants are in terms of Indigenous people. The government looks at gender, Aboriginal status, and as I said, I don't think Aboriginal status is a determinant of health. I reject that. Minority status, early life education, employment, working conditions, food security, healthcare services, housing, income, and income distribution, social safety net, social exclusion, inclusion, unemployment, and employment security. I think some of those are valid, but not all of those. If you flip it, the Canadian Institute for Health Information has said that social and economic conditions actually have a profound impact on the health of Aboriginal peoples, and the contemporary health and well-being must be viewed in a broad historical and social context. And I think that's really what I was trying to provide today, is that we can't blame history. That doesn't do us any good, but having that context is vitally important. So here's where I sit on this. I think that Indigenous social determinants of health that Charlotte Lope Redding, and Fred Ween have identified, I think this is vitally important. If you look at proximal determinants of health, so health behaviors, physical environments, employment, income, education, and food insecurity, those are vitally important. And the intermediate determinants of health, such as health care, educational systems, community infrastructure, resources, capacities, environmental stewardship, and cultural continuity, those are vitally important. And then the distal determinants of health that we've been spending a lot of time talking about: colonialism, racism, social exclusion, and self-determination. I think those are absolutely vitally important. And you put those together, then I think you have a complex framework to work from. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the stats, but I do have them here, just to sort of show you that we have a lot of issues to deal with, but we have really a lot of resilience and a lot of strengths. And I think that anything we do has to come from strengths and not focus on negativity, but certainly to understand that yes, our population is young, it's growing fast, and if you flip, because I know I'm running out of time, if you flip, we do have certainly a lot of issues to address. If you want to flip it again. Our life expectancy, for example, is still not very high. Preventable deaths, for example, circulatory diseases and injury account for 50% of all preventable deaths. I think that we really have to address some of these issues. Our suicide rates are still very high. Our common causes of deaths are injury and poisoning, and our primary cause of death for children less than 10 is unintentional, which means accidents. We still have a lot of work to do, but we have so much in our community, we have so much strength, we have so much resilience, and we have to start to focus on how can we address some of these issues through the strength of our communities. Yeah, I think you can flip this again. I mean, you could have all my slides, but obviously HIV is still an issue, particularly for Indigenous women in Canada. I think the biggest elephant in the room, though, if I may, is where we started at the beginning, and that is systemic racism. I think I've been asked at several presentations to talk about access to healthcare, and when they say that, they mean geographical access, but I actually think the bigger problem is access to healthcare in terms of safety, in terms of Indigenous people feeling safe to walk into a clinic and not feel stigmatized or not experience racism. And I think that we have to do better, not only in healthcare systems, but in our education systems. I've been hearing stories of students not feeling welcome in a classroom, students not feeling like they want to ask questions. We have to create safe spaces in our communities for Indigenous people, full stop. Whether that is in a healthcare clinic, whether it's in a classroom, wherever we are. I mean, this is 2018. And I think cultural safety is a top of the moment topic because it is really important for us to start deconstructing the systems that we live in, and they are colonial systems. And the sooner we come face to face with that, the sooner that we will be able to achieve reconciliation. And that's really, really what I wanted to talk about today. The last point I want to make on this is that, colonial history is a process, and if it has disconnected many of us from our communities, from our languages, from our cultures, and I think that for the most part, many of us have either reclaimed that or in the process of that, or we have many knowledge keepers, and we have to take that back. It is really important to do that. And so, like I said, I think taking community engagement approaches, ensuring that we're taking direction from communities in whatever we're doing, whether it's research, whether it's in academia, it is extremely valuable. And just a reminder for me is that our knowledge keepers are our PhDs. They're the real PhDs, and we still have so much to learn from them. And for me, it's important that we acknowledge that and that we remember, where our roots are. I think I'm almost done, so that we can have just some questions. I had a few other slides around socioeconomic status and how important the role of poverty can play. But again, I think we can flip that. So I'll give you my slides. These are just, again, how important education is and the role of education is. It's the new buffalo, right? That's what we say on the prairies. This is just some information on Métis. We don't have good data for Métis, so I always like to sneak that in, but mortality rates for Métis are still high. And these are some of my dissertation findings. I did a dissertation 10 years ago now on Métis people's health, and I just was able to show that racism and socioeconomic status combined to create poor health outcomes for Métis people. It was one of the first times that I was able to show that, and because there's not a lot, not a lot of research out there for Métis people, and essentially I had to use self-rated health because we don't have accurate data for Métis people. So I guess in summary, colonization has resulted in intergenerational effects, but we are resilient, and even though Indigenous people might still experience these impacts, we also hold the solutions. And particularly, our communities hold the solutions. And so the issues are not historical, they're continuing through policy today, and they affect more than just Indigenous people. These aren't Indigenous issues. And they are systemic in nature, and they go back, if you think about the definition of genocide, did it happen? And if it did, how did we heal as a community and as a nation? Okay,
so we have about 30 minutes or so for questions. So we can, I just want to say chimiwich to Dr. Bourassa for that presentation. And so we can start with, Wilmore.
Thank you for coming and sharing, and glad that our choir is getting bigger. The choir of those echoing the sentiments that have been the message for so long. And the comment you made about the education is the new buffalo. I think we need to have more buffalo in the school, meaning we need to bring more of the culture into the institution that is continuing to cause the problem, because it isn't changing, but we have to change. So the shift needs to occur, and I equate that to the message of the doomsday clock and the extinction of Indigenous peoples coincide. And so that premise of the importance and what you've identified, that health, is what the elders tell us, that Indigenous knowledge is actually human knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And if we as humans want to slow down that clock and bring about that healing, that we need to begin healing the humans that we've been denying as humans. So that presentation echoes the sentiment of Indigenous health increase is human health increase.
Yep, I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
people often say to me, well, why should we really care about investing in Indigenous health, or, you know, in my role as scientific director, you know, why should we care about that? Why should we invest in that? And I always say, you know, a healthy Indigenous population is a healthy Canadian population, right? Full stop.
Any more questions? Comments?
Hi, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experience when it's time to consider determinant for health. And you spoke before that, you know, being Indigenous is not a determinant. But we know today, like in the health system as well as in courts, that it is considered as such. So I would like to hear a little bit more about your struggling to make sure that this racism is not perpetuated into the way that the medical system works.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat the questions for everybody?
Oh, she basically asked, she said about the Indigenous identity being a determinant of health, and how I'm trying to address it so that it doesn't become basically, you know, a racist sort of notion in terms of, I think I'm getting that right, in terms of being a determinant of health, especially in the medical system. It is a bit of a struggle, and not everybody may agree with me either. That's the other point. The reason I don't see it as a determinant of health is that I think it can be used in a negative way. That, you know, your indigeneity somehow is a determinant of your health. You know, I mean, it's one thing to declare if you're Indigenous. That's one thing. I think that's important. I think. You know, for me, for example, if I'm in the hospital, I have no problem identifying that I'm Indigenous, but to say that's a determinant of my health is a totally different, you know, ballgame as far as I'm concerned. So I think there has to be a really clear understanding that there's a difference. You know, identifying as Indigenous, I think, is important, or more specifically, First Nation, Métis, or Inuit, because I think getting a good understanding of the people you're serving is very important. You know, when you talk about patient-oriented care, for example, I think that's important. You know, I used to, before they started counting accurate information in hospitals, they used to only have like First Nation, because they could have the card, you know, the card so that they could get paid basically. I would like put a little box under there, and I'd put Métis beside, and then I'd check the box, and I knew they weren't really going to do anything with that, but somehow it made me feel better, so that it was a message to say, you know, you really should be counting, you know, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, right? That you should be, you know, providing patient-oriented care. And anyway, so to me that is important. There's many reasons why you would want to do that if people feel safe enough to, you know, to self-declare, and not everybody will, but I think that, you know, there's good ways to do it, and there's bad ways to do it. But saying that your indigeneity is a determinant, there's something very wrong about that, and I think that while you could argue that it could be a positive thing, for the most part, it feels very negative, and I don't think that saying your identity for anybody is a determinant. I just, you know, to me, I think that language just needs to be taken completely right out of the equation. And I dare say, if I asked anybody else if your identity is a determinant of health, would most people even think about that? I mean, I think most people have to really, really think about that and be like, what does that have to do with anything, right? That's how it is for me. And so I think that there's some real discussions that have to, because mostly these discussions happen without Indigenous people involved, right? And so I certainly can't speak for Indigenous people. I can speak for me, but I think we have to have engagement with First Nation, Métis, Inuit people, Northern, on reserve, up reserve, and yeah, that does take time, but it is so important to get it right. So that's my response for it. Sorry, you both had the hands at the same time.
Well, I just maybe to pick up on Noelle's point around social determinants of health being interpreted through a racist lens or a lens that doesn't include the definition of cultural safety you discussed. Like I've met nurses at the hospital whose perception is that if an Indigenous woman comes in, they must call a social worker because that person will obviously have extra problems when she's having her baby. Like nurses have said that to my face. That was about 5-6 years ago I heard that one. Mm-hmm. And then I listened to some of my students who are in different placements in the hospital telling me similar stories or similar attitudes. And I wonder if one of the things that happens when people read the social determinants of health, the ones that you critiqued, they take that as literally a predictor of people's behavior as opposed to a description of, let's say, how people fare in the healthcare system. Because the determinant of health there is, have I been subjected to racism all of my life, as opposed to, is this something that's lodged in my body that's a problem? Mm-hmm. And I think from the position of being an educator, what did we do with that generation of nurses? What did we do wrong at the university? I mean, I'm picking on nurses, but pick on any group of students that is coming out of the contemporary university. Mm-hmm. What can we do differently within our education to make people aware of the way they look at the world, particularly white students? I think for other students who are racialized, there might actually be issues that are in common that might allow people to relate more easily to the things you're describing. But yeah. As an educator, that's what I'm hoping to work with when thinking about your talk.
Well, I think you're right, and I think actually cultural safety can do a lot to address that, particularly when you think about encouraging self-reflexivity and really embedding in the curriculum, looking at and speaking. It's not a comfortable thing, but speaking about bias and systemic racism and all those things and what they look like, and really if you could embed it in the curriculum, particularly once you have those hard conversations, which they are hard, and then ensuring that self-reflexivity happens. Like I was making, they didn't like it, but I was making nurses do journaling on a weekly basis, and having sharing circles and bringing speakers in and bringing knowledge keepers in, and it is hard, tough slogging through, and I don't know how much difference it made, because they only had one class, but I really tried at the very least to get them to do the hard work, and I don't know if they carried through with it or they didn't, but part of it is really trying to embed the cultural safety framework into their everyday work, that it is everyday work, right? It's not something that you can just do a little bit of it and leave it aside. And that's the best advice that I can give. And I think critiquing the frameworks is important, because critical analysis is essential. And so, not really giving them the answers, but trying to get them to get to that point where they can see, well, why would using indigeneity as an example, why would that be problematic, or is it problematic, and trying to have them get there. But I think it's it's vitally important, and I find that nurses in particular, that they want just the answer, right? But trying to get them to do some, and I understand why, right? Because I think a lot of clinicians are like that, and I get that, because that's what they're trained for. But if at least in one class that they can really get there to do some of that slogging through, because it will take them far once they get onto the wards, because they are going to be presented with a lot of these very, very hard critical issues. Randy?
Go ahead.
Oh,
I was
sorry.
just gonna jump in, just to touch on that, kind of on like policy issues and even going deeper. So for example, nursing, if you're thinking nursing, think about where nursing came in and Indian hospitals and getting people to understand kind of where that grooming sets in and starting to have those conversations. Like, we need to embed some of the kind of curriculum that we're talking about here today at a beginning level to be able to start to unpack some of those. Because like the most famous quote that ever sticks out to me is Marie Sinclair, in order to understand kind of what Canadians understand about Indigenous people, because when we were being taught as Indigenous people that we were, heathens, savages, and pagans, so were the settler communities that came to our country. So they were being taught that about us when we were being taught that about ourselves. So unlearning really needs to happen, and conversations like this, Carrie, are great to have, because there's a lot of unlearning that needs to come. And when you're talking about like nursing, that's a profession that that's who, in education or the nuns, like this is our system, our whole system is set up on this colonial policy. And so when you really start to unpack that, you realize there's a lot underlying going on. Yeah.
Thank you, Randy, it's very true. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's quite fine. Thank you for coming, Dr. Bourassa, to share with us and to create a space where we can have a discussion, an open discussion about cultural safety. I am a nurse. It's okay to pick on nurses.
Not meant to pick on your
I'll give you that.
You do such hard work.
Yeah.
Well, and to validate what some of the issues that have been raised. I've been a nurse for 33 years, a prof for 12, and a veteran of the hospital system for 29. So there was some overlap. And they are the situations in the hospital that you see where there's outright racism, bias are real. They happen, and they happen on an all too regular basis. And I think that part of the problem is that it's a fairly white, homogenous system. With some exceptions, but especially in Sudbury, and more north you go, the more homogenous it is, and the more white it is. I don't ever see too many nurses in the education system who are of Indigenous backgrounds, and they may not identify as well for a number of reasons. So without there being anyone to represent the culture within the nursing population, it becomes difficult to then, defend or to support or to protect that population when you do present to hospital. And we're often, people are often afraid of those who are different from themselves, right? And so, there are a lot of, constructs and old ways of thinking that are hard to break down. And there are some champions within the system who do try to defend the rights of others. They are there. But then there are those who are quite prepared to violate the rights of others. So I think that there's a long road ahead. And this discussion was providing a lot of information and a lot of insight that can be helpful when I'm the only one that can speak from my own faculty that is here. And I know that at the hospital, there has been, they have identified the need for sensitivity training. These things, you have to get by. It takes time. I went through the same kind of exercise with French language services. Back in 1988 or 86, the law was passed, and in 1990, I became a coordinator at the hospital, and j'ai mangé des maudits volets. I got a lot of baptism by fire. It was a long, hard road to try and bring in, institute French language services, and this was, legislated. So, I can give you some good news that, seeing the need to see change, I've decided to add to one of my classrooms some discussion on cultural safety, on Indigenous issues in healthcare. And to prepare my class for that real world that they're going to be faced. I mean, they're going to be in a group of people, you know, they're going to want to be able to fit in, and how are they going to want to fit in? Are they going to follow through with some bad examples, or are they going to, you know, follow through with the ethical way to present themselves or to care for those who are different from themselves? So it's not an easy road ahead.
It's not. No, you're right. Thank you for that.
You're not alone.
If anyone has, you know, any kind of constructive feedback, I mean, I'm certainly willing to accept it or to entertain it. But
The nursing program definitely needs more Indigenous content. I taught recently in the course, and there's very little. The students knew very little. And so I really feel that the curriculum itself needs to be looked at. That's just from an outside perspective.
Yeah.
But you know, when you look, there's a whole study on all health courses across Canada and the university courses, and there's a lot of, it's surprising that there's still a lack of Indigenous content in a lot of the courses. And so, I mean, that's gotta be a start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's an administrator thing. Like, if it's your priority, just make it a priority.
That's
So you
there's
put
also,
your money where your mouth is. Like, if you're, that's my thought process. Like, if you're talking about it, that's how you change it. You look at your administrators, you start hiring, like, there's a lot of competent Indigenous people. And that there are curriculums, like Sina's doing amazing stuff. There's tons of really cool stuff that's happening. We talk about that, but it's like you really have to embed it in your whole, and I think that's what you're trying to talk about, is like, how do you do that? And you just have to, you just prioritize it and do it.
When you get there, you'll do it.
There's also a committee here at Laurentian for the Indigenous curriculum, and one of the student representatives reached out to me. I'm a former graduate of the nursing program, but she reached out to me to ask if I could be more involved in that, but because I'm still a student, like, that's a lot of commitment to be able to, like, you know, like, ask students to be doing this type of work in the curriculum of, like, the nursing program of the whole university. So some of the issues that she raised, and also, you know, like, some of the things that some of the students were also sharing with me were same things that were occurring 10 years ago when I was in the program. So there's got to be, like what Randy said, a lot more commitment to creating those changes at the administration level.
yeah, and I think one of the issues, or one of the challenges that this profession faces is that in the 30 years that I've been in the profession, 30-some, there's been a whole lot downloaded onto nurses, right? The curriculum has been increased and intensified in depth and in breadth, and it's still a 4-year program. So, you know, there have been some essential elements of nursing training that have been left aside to incorporate other things that have come into play. So again, it's you know, you got a frame that's this size. How much are you going to pack into that frame, right? You have to unpack some things. So until, you know, at some point in time, someone comes with the realization that it takes more than 4 years to train a nurse now, that there's going to have to be some pre-admission you know, it's called an activity, 2 years of a science program before even coming into a nursing program, so that all of this content can be addressed in a 4-year bachelor's degree.
School of Ed has 2 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
I
School of
think-
Ed is 2 years. It went up from 1 to 2.
But I think, like, cultural safety doesn't just, like, isn't just relevant for nurses. Like, every healthcare profession should be trained in cultural safety.
Every profession.
Person,
I think
every person in this country
Yeah.
should be trained to be.
So it should be a
Is it
required.
post-degree
It could be a
training, or is
requirement.
it, I think it should be within.
I think it should be embedded in with every program, and I don't think it would be that hard to do, to be quite honest, so.
Education is in the process. He has a question over there, which is
I just wanted to add to the conversation. One of the biggest, so to parallel, like, a person often thinks they're not homophobic if they don't beat me up. or they don't throw stones at me, right? So they think they've done me a favor, and they think that, well, because I've said hi and I'm smiling at you, I'm doing you a great justice. And it's not, right? So like, for example, when I first met my family doctor, and so he was asking me about questions and whatever, so he's asking about relationship status, and so I'm married, I have a husband, so he was like, oh, okay, great, good to hear, and he's like, well, if you guys ever decide to open up your marriage, here's the HPV vaccine for you, we have PrEP available for you, we have this, we have that. So it was, like, to me, it was like, why would you offer me all the, like he immediately assumed because I'm a homosexual man that I'm gonna be opening up my marriage, that we're gonna have, so, and I mean, so the point being is, so like, they think they're doing you a favor by offering you these things, but really it's very detrimental. And I think that, like you were saying about bringing in social services, they think they're helping you. And that's part of the problem, is that they think they're doing you a great justice. They think they're helping you. But like it's wrong. Like, that was very offensive, and I couldn't believe when I left that I was offered all these things. Like, I mean, like, I'm grateful for the medical system. I'm grateful for all these advances, and yeah, like, there's all these options to protect anyone from all these. It's like, why am I being offered these? Like, everyone should be offered that, not just me, because of this. And I think that's one of the greatest, like in like the medical system, like, that's true for everyone, right? So they come in with this stereotype, and they think, oh, well, okay, well, I'm gonna offer you this, and I'm gonna help you with this, but you've actually just insulted me. Like, you've greatly insulted me. And I went home to my husband, and I was like, like, I was hurt, because like how could you assume that of me? Like, I didn't say anything about that, and like, to assume that that's the kind of like person that I would be without asking, or without, so I think that, like, introducing that into the curriculums and being like, remember that, like, even though you think you're helping me, you might actually be doing more detriment than help. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important as part of the conversation, as part of the curriculums, mm-hmm. to remind people, like, just think for a second, like, is this gonna help them? Even though it's got great benefit, this is gonna help them, or gonna be detrimental to them as a person, as a community. So I think that's gotta be put in there.
So we have time for one more question or comment. Shelley?
I wanted to follow up with that conversation. Sorry, it's a comment, and please feel free to add to that. But the issue of cultural safety is systemic. It is not individualized, and the solution to that is not having more Indigenous students in that study, more Indigenous students taking nursing. It's not their role to defend what's going on and why there's racism. It's not their role to represent. They are their students. They should be safe in that environment. And it reminds me of an example of when my son was in grade 7 or something. And first of all, I'm Indigenous, and my son, in this particular class, and it was known that his parents were Indigenous, and the teacher was talking about some conflict between the settlers and Indigenous people, and he asked my son, why were the Indians afraid and why did they run away? And that was totally inappropriate. For him, for that question to be asked of him, and for him to be expected to represent all Indigenous people, and for him to defend them, and for him to have the knowledge of all of this. That is not his role, and that was totally inappropriate. He is there as a student, and just as Indigenous people are taking nursing, they are there as students, and their role is to learn. This is a systemic issue. This is not a personal. This is more than an individual issue. So I offer that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I think so many students in grad school, I hear people saying, we're talking about this issue today, and they'll pick on the grad student to do the session or to lead the session, and that is completely unfair. And it has to stop. And I can't tell you how many times I hear this and how it takes students off track. I've had some students discontinue, take a break, because of this, because they feel this pressure that they have to represent their communities. And as you said, it is completely unfair. We need the Indigenous students that are in school to be able to be students like anybody else. And you don't usually see any other students picked out like that. I haven't seen that. Maybe I'm wrong and maybe it's happened, but I haven't seen that. But I see it very often with Indigenous students. As though it's their job, as you said, to somehow represent Indigenous communities or even their own communities, and it's not their job. It's their job to go and be students and learn and not have to have that burden. And I couldn't agree with you more. I see it a lot, and it has to stop. It really is systemic. If you don't take anything else away, take that it is a systemic issue. That's really what I was trying to get across. And that, it's not meant to pick on any individual, any occupation. I know how hard nurses work. I know how hard physicians work. I know how hard profs work. It's not meant to be any kind of an individual issue. It really is systemic. And because it's systemic, we can address it, right? There's ways to address it, but we'll never address it as individuals, right? We have to address it together. And that's really, really what my message was. And again, thank you for sticking around. It's getting late. The sun's going down. I just want to say, Miigwech, from the bottom of my heart, if there's anything I can do, this is definitely a passion area for me. Please feel free to reach out. I don't know how much I can help, but I'm happy to try. Thanks for all the work you do.